Greetings, dear viewers, ladies and gentlemen. This is our weekly AddisDialogue, which deals with current issues unfolding in Ethiopia. We'll talk about the cessation of hostilities between the federal government and TPLF and how it should be propped up for the maximum benefits. And in this regard, my guest today is Dr. Derese Getachew. He's associate professor of sociology at the Iowa University. We're going to talk about the cessation of hostilities between the two sides, the psychosocial impacts of the war prior to the peace truce signed between the federal government and the TPLF, and various roles to be played by every actor concerned. With the program, I'm Shifara Lakaw. Do stay with us. Derese, thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me, Shifara. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Absolutely. As you know, prior to the peace truce signed between the federal government and TPLF, the northern part of Ethiopia had been going through destructive war that claimed the lives of many and resulted in the destruction of property. So can you briefly walk me through the socio-psychological impacts of the war that you observed, especially as a sociologist?
Thank you again, Shifara. Well, as you rightfully put it, the first loss that we have in these 2 years of intractable and very violent war is the loss of lives. And I have estimates, being flown around from one agency to another, the most conservative being, more than 500,000 Ethiopians on both sides have died in the conflict. Others take it all the way up to 1.5 million people, but one is too many, right? So the death of, civilians and people in uniform, people in combat in this civil war itself was tragic. Not to mention the amount and the magnitude of the displacement crisis that the country is facing. As you said, I'm a student of sociology, and in particular, I study forced displacement, conflict, refugees. And, this issue is close to my heart. And right now, as for the International Organization of Migration, IOM's statistics or data, Ethiopia ranks third in the number of internally displaced people. First comes Ukraine, of course, because of the Ukraine-Russia conflict. Then is Syria. And Ethiopia is top on the list from the African continent. More than 2.4 million people, it's said, are displaced, not just by the Tigray crisis, but all sorts of crises going on throughout the breadth of the land. Conflicts happening in Oromia, conflicts happening in the eastern escarpments of the Amhara region that also face the Oromia, Western Wallagga and Eastern Wallagga zone. So, all of this could be said as a major challenge, not to mention the fact that, people, families were literally torn apart. Basic services were not around, available electricity, clean water, telecom and internet. And so not just Tigray, but Amhara and Afar regions are reeling back from the conflict and the impacts of the conflict. So all of these, you could argue, bring about a huge pain and a huge loss to the communities which were caught in the crossfires.
Now, fast forward to the present. As you know, the federal government and leaders of TPLF have reached this consensus to put an end to this destructive war by signing the historic peace truce in South Africa. And in its aftermath, we're witnessing different positive developments, including family reunions, restoration of services and flights, following the high-level delegation visit to Mekelle. How will some of these things help heal the scars as a result of the destructive war?
Well, unfortunately, Shifarao, much of this conflict started from an elite contest on what the future of Ethiopia's political dispensation should be like. And I have to be honest with you, much of it has to do with, elites from the TPLF and, the rest of the EPRDF, which later became the Prosperity Party. And, thousands of civilians who have little or less to do with the nature of the political contest are, as we say, victimized by it. So for me to see the video footage of people, flying back to Mekelle and, meeting and having reunions with their family members is really heartening. The onset of electricity and internet services are really rewarding. And to be honest, the federal government should be credited for restoring these services and trying to repair and maintain the infrastructure which was damaged during the conflict in a short time as possible. All of this has to be recognized. Not to mention, though, the Tigrayans deserves this. They are citizens of the land, and this dispute has never been about, severing Tigray's ties to the Ethiopian political center. It has always been about a belligerent party which actually wanted to install a violent change of regime and a violent change of government in Addis Ababa. And that plan was thwarted, and that plan did not succeed. But I'm sure, and I'm confident that the Pretoria Agreement and the two rounds of discussions in Nairobi would bring home the conclusion of one, the disarmament and the demobilization of TPLF combatants, and the restoration of an interim Tigrayan civilian administration, and a healing process, like you said, which would be done at a people-to-people level, at an intercommunal level.
And Darasa, as also you have been following the developments in Ethiopia, as you know, government, universities, and the National Dialogue Commission have agreed to work in collaboration. What are some of the roles that you see need to be played by scholars on the one hand and by governments, officials, and concerned bodies on the other hand? Two questions in one.
Well, these are very difficult questions, Shifara, to unpack and give you sort of a short and tight answer. But you're absolutely right. Listen, Ethiopia is caught up in these two narratives about what its political future ought to be like. There is a significant component of the body politic which literally indicts the current ethno-federal design as the source of our trouble, the source of our conflict. We feel identity has been over politicized, and the sort of pan-Ethiopian values intersections that we've had as citizens have been depleted and eroded, and we have to change course, right? There is another segment of the population which, sincerely believes this has nothing to do with the ethno-federal design, that this constitution has bestowed unprecedented rights and domains of influence for collectives, including ethnic groups, which the Constitution names nations, nationalities, and peoples. And this contradiction, this tension between these two overriding political narratives has to be reconciled. Some sort of a compromise covenant, a compromise social contract has to be signed. And I hope and I believe the Ethiopian National Dialogue Commission would rise up to this challenge and would be a platform where genuine, inclusive, and sincere political dialogue about what the future of Ethiopia should be like is discussed in earnest. And when you do these discussions, obviously they have to be literally informed discussions, nuanced discussions, and faculty, professors, intellectuals who are in Ethiopia's higher education institutions should be at the forefront of setting the agenda, coming up with alternative policy ideals about what they think would favor Ethiopia's peace, Ethiopia's stability, and Ethiopia's economic growth in the future. So I think it's a natural alliance, it's a natural coalition that should be strengthened and that should be celebrated between the higher education institution of Ethiopia and the National Dialogue Commission. I should add, though, Shifarao. I don't think we have the luxury of time planning on and further postponing the actual onset of these discussions and deliberations. It's already been a year since this commission was installed, but so far we have not seen any actual deliberations and outcomes happening. And I think the Ethiopian National Dialogue Commission should start in earnest and then show the public that this dialogue is indeed genuine and it is indeed legitimate, and it would, in the final analysis, give us a legitimate social contract by way of a constitution.
Great idea raised there. I think the diaspora has also great role to play as part of the peace process of Ethiopia. Already, we are witnessing encouraging results in this regard. So, what is your message to fellow diaspora Ethiopian expats in this regard?
Well, Shifara, as you know, the diaspora is very productive and helpful when the national interest is at stake. Like, for instance, in the past 2 years, when unfortunate developments took place, when Western policymakers, especially here in the United States and in the European Union, were unfairly alleging that the federal government is the problem in this conflict, ignoring all kinds of atrocities and inequities done by the party that started the conflict, the diaspora rose up to the occasion and voiced its interest, protested, lobbied, cajoled its political representatives to influence the foreign policy of the countries that it is now residing at, predominantly here in the States and in Europe. During peacetime, this sort of solidarity can continue, and it would benefit Ethiopia if it continues. I would say, not to pin our hopes high on the diaspora itself. The diaspora itself is also a mirror reflection of the political divisions and the political stripes that you see here in Ethiopia. And so to forge sort of a pan-Ethiopian coming together of all factions of the diaspora and to have a buy-in from them and to make them contribute to the success and fulfillment of the National Dialogue Commission's mission would be very paramount. It would be very, I think the government has to do that, reach out. The government has to encourage, has to open platforms and opportunities for members of the diaspora to come in, to contribute, and to be heard in the process, right? And in doing so, the country at large would benefit, Shifara.
I think the social structures, social strata also need to be laid out in such a way that it will contribute positive developments, positive share for the peace process being applied here. So how should the different social structures be used to get the maximum results out of the peace deal?
Well, that's a much more challenging task because I study transnational communities, diasporic communities, especially politicized diasporic communities because of conflict. It actually takes a longer time for them to heal and to have rapprochement than the conflicting parties in the country. And that's what we're witnessing now. There is a segment of the Tigrayan diaspora which is dismissive and still very skeptical and cynical of the peace agreement that was reached between the government and the TPLF. Delegitimizing and calling the TPLF leaderships renegades and sellouts to the government, there is a section of, a population, a diaspora population, which is now lamenting that the Ethiopian government has actually reneged on its promises, that it has compromised and sold out to almost all of the demands of the TPLF. So, the diaspora has been critical of both sides. And for these two sides to see eye to eye, to sit down and to have honest and sincere dialogues, that's a very difficult task. And as a sociologist, I would offer you three important, variables, notions why this is difficult. One, you see, the diaspora is very articulate and very emotionally invested in what is going on inside the country, but they do not usually bear the cost of the political consequences, right? It is one thing to say the government should do this or TPLF should do that. It is another thing to live in the country and to live the aftermath of these political consequences, right? So, because of that, there is this tendency to drift toward a polarized opinion, right? Second, for all its contribution, there's also this elitist dimension. The diaspora feels like it's more aware, more educated, more resourceful, and wants to dictate terms to whatever happens inside the country. Now, and that again is difficult because you're not living in the country, you're not making decisions whichever way, and the best you can be is an aid. The best you can do is to help and assist developments and not steer and direct, right? So to put the diaspora in its rightful place and harvest its potential for good cause is challenging because sometimes it may not feel comfortable doing it, okay? Last but not least, Shifara, in our case, these ethnic divisions have run amok. They have become very extreme, and people tend to sort themselves out by ethnic and religious divisions. They tune into media outlets and discussions of those that reinforce and affirm their earlier held biases. And there are little to no platforms where, say, the Tigrayan diaspora would have a discussion with folks from Oromia or folks from Amhara, right? So the platforms are not available. That's the point I'm trying to send across. So for all these practical reasons, forging that sort of, a rapprochement between the diasporic communities itself is a much more difficult task to accomplish than to aid the process that's unfolding inside Ethiopia. Shifara.
Great idea. Again, there are two seemingly extreme points, I think. So obviously, Ethiopia has a lot on its plate to deal with, and finding a midway between the half is, I think, the great task ahead. If I get the point correctly, Doctor.
Absolutely, absolutely. I think as Ethiopians, Shifara, we need to learn the art of compromise. Politics is not about absolutes, and there is this tendency of Ethiopian politicians to think of their positions as almost as if it is a religious dogma. And you cannot govern, you cannot run a multi-ethnic body of more than 84 ethnic groups, multi-faith body, and you have the second largest population in Africa. This is such a complex country, right? And that complexity should educate our political elite to learn on how to bring people together and how to build bridges and not walls and not harp on polarized opinions and be more divisive and be more hostile, right? And to be honest with you, that also requires a lot of change in our political culture. Politics in Ethiopia is always the winner takes all. What we have is a victor's justice, and what we have had historically were victors and vanquished. And to come out from such a mindset and to imagine a political space where political majorities rule but minorities' rights are respected, that sort of a deal is new to us. And I hope our political elite would rise up to this challenge and change the course of the country.
Dr. Derese, as you know, the rapprochement between the US and Africa, especially between that of Ethiopia and the US, is improving, especially in the aftermath of the US Leader Summit that has recently taken place. So I think the US also has to play its role for the betterment of this East African nation. What roles do you see as a sociologist here? What should be played by the US?
Well, that's a great question, Shafara. I have a stake in this as someone who lives in the United States, exactly. Whose kids grow up here in the United States, and what happens in this country's domestic politics really affects me firsthand. So does the foreign policy of the United States. Most of us were really disappointed that the United States reading about the conflict was somewhat biased toward the belligerents when the conflict started. And it took a lot of writing, a lot of activism, a lot of social media presence to push the narrative that, the United States should at least be level-handed. And if it were to be concerned about human rights violations, war crimes, or atrocities, it should do so toward all parties, the Ethiopian government, the TPLF, and Eritrean troops, and that it should play a much more constructive role in bringing these warring parties to a lasting, peaceful solution. Well, to its credit, it did. The United States was involved in aiding and abetting the peace process that the African Union led and stirred. Its special envoys, three, have been involved in that process from the origin. And, I think they also recognize the fact that, there is hope and that the rapprochement is holding ground and following the conclusion of, the monitoring and verification and compliance process by AU observers and the technical team of African experts, I think the United States feels like this would bring the conflict to a close and it would usher in a new era for Ethiopia, right? So I think we should build on this momentum. And the gesture that President Biden showed by inviting Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed and the Ethiopian delegation and according it all diplomatic courtesy and respect that the country deserves tells you a lot. Okay. Now, again, this is about balance, but I should mention this, Shafara. The Ethiopian government needs to do a lot of work in building up its diplomatic presence in the United States, in building relationships in its legislative bodies, both in the lower house, the Congress, and the Senate, and also, working with different agencies of the United States government, the State Department, the Department of Defense. And I have to be honest with you, I think the Ethiopian government was lagging behind in forging these relationships, maintaining them, and stirring them towards its end behind the TPLF. Well, people were saying the TPLF had the advantage of building these relationships for almost 3 decades, and it has its allies, its friends, and folks who are in key strategic positions, both in Brussels and in Washington D.C. But that cannot be an excuse forever. This government has been in power for 4 years. You cannot simply lament that the TPLF outplayed you because they had advantage for 3 decades, right? You have to start doing your work in earnest. And I mean, the Ethiopian diaspora can actually help in doing that. And I'm not sure to what extent Ethiopia's diplomatic corps is involved in harvesting the goodwill and the relationships and the resources of the Ethiopian diaspora toward that end. But I think that deserves attention.
Despite the ups and downs, the many challenges that Ethiopia has been going through, I think, Ethiopia's prospect is on a positive trajectory, and this is really encouraging. Do you have any final message, Dr. Derese, before we, conclude this?
Well, I have two messages, Shifara. One, I would like to thank you for bearing with me. The time zone differences between where I am and where you are so staggering. So you had to stay up late to interview me. And then thank you for that. My gratitude and appreciation for you for that. And second, thank you too for all the work that you're doing at the Ethiopian television, especially on the English desk. Because one area where our voices and our interests have not been articulated and was in this area of beaming and broadcasting to the international audience, right? We have a few outlets that do it in English, be it government or private, and I think that also needs to be beefed up. You live in an era of 24/7 news and opinion cycle where global media corporations happen to make and shape global opinion on international affairs. And Ethiopia cannot afford to seclude itself and live in this space where it only broadcasts to itself. We simply cannot do that in this era of globalization. And so the task and the responsibility of young people, journalists like yourself has is immense, immense. So keep doing what you're doing. More power to you, Shifarao. Last thing is I would like to, for the authorities who hopefully would listen to us is, we have optimistically closed a chapter on the northern front, but the ensuing conflict in Oromia and what has been done, the innocent killing of Amhara civilians in Oromia, and now what has morphed into an intercommunal violence between Amhara militia and OLF Shani, that has to be fixed. I think, I know the government knows this, but I think unless otherwise, the Amhara and the Oromo hinterland of this nation comes to a peaceful end, I hope, that this would be settled. And I feel like that has to be addressed, Shifara. And so I hope that you would send across my concern toward the audience in Ethiopia. But once again, thanks for having me, brother.
Dr. Derese Getachew, Associate Professor of Sociology at the Iowa University, also author and political analyst. Thank you so much for the ideas. And also you're doing a great job, especially in becoming a voice to Ethiopia. Thanks a lot and keep up the great job. Thank you for your time.
Appreciate you. Appreciate you. Have a beautiful rest of the day. Bye-bye, my brother.
Well, dear viewers, with that, we come to the end of today's program. Thank you as well for having been with us. Until I see you next time with another program. It's goodbye from me, Shifarao.